From enchanted greatswords that harness the power of the moon, to a large finger that destroys your enemies by flicking them, Elden Ring has tons of weapons to choose from, and picking the best one for your journey can seem pretty daunting. So in this video, we'll be going over the top 10 weapons in Elden Ring that'll make any encounter a walk in the park. First up at number 10, I have the Starfist. It's no secret that fist weapons are good, and some people think they're the best weapons in the game because of their fast and agile movesets. And the best fist weapon in Elden Ring by far are the Starfist, and they can be acquired fairly early on, just left of the Colosseum on a body near the West Capital Rampart Site of Grace. They only require 12 strength and 8 dexterity, and they scale off of both, making them perfect at any stage of the game. What makes Starfist one of the best weapons in the game, however, is a high amount of stagger they deal, the innate bleed on them, and the fact they deal strike damage. Strike damage is the least resisted damage type in Elden Ring, making it extremely strong, and with the innate bleed buildup, you deal extra damage to almost any type of enemy in the game, meaning if it can bleed, it's taking extra damage, and if it can't bleed, it's most likely made out of rock, which takes extra damage from strike. The amount of stagger generated by the Starfist is also ridiculous. The charge heavy attack hits twice, and you can easily land multiple in a row, staggering even the biggest of enemies. You can also run a ton of different Ash of Wars on the Starfist, but I highly recommend Endure, as it allows for high damage bursts by taking a small amount of damage to increase your attack power, letting you absolutely shred bosses. The only catch is the fact they are still fist weapons, so you have to get used to close range and dodging extremely close range attacks. But moving on to number 9, I have the Spear of the Impaler. This weapon is crafted from the remembrance of the Impaler, which is acquired from Mesmer, so you can't get this spear until you are well in the shadow of the Earth Tree, but it can immediately change the game entirely for you. The key to this weapon is the Ash of War Mesmer's Assault, which can be used in 3 different stages, each stronger than the last. It also provides hyper armor, ending with you slamming the spear into the ground and creating a ton of spears that rise up from the ground, dealing a huge chunk of damage. Adding on to the insane range most spears already have, you can actually throw the Spear of the Impaler covering large distances and leaving a small explosion of fire when it lands. The downsides to this weapon is that the weapon scales off of Dex and Faith, meaning you would have to put a solid amount of points into Faith before it does considerable damage. The upsides tend to outweigh this one though, with the best Ash of War and the extreme range making most boss fights a joke. If you are looking for a fun and unique way to absolutely speed through the game on a New Game Plus playthrough, I highly recommend this weapon. But next up at number 8, I have the Bolt of Grand Sachs. First things first, this weapon allows you to throw lightning spears without having to put anything into Faith. Just like the Spear of the Impaler, the added range of the weapon art makes taking out foes at a distance or keeping foes at a distance very easy. The melee from the weapon itself is quite lackluster, but if you build it around the Ash of War, you can deal some amazing damage. Using it with stuff like Hallow's Shabiri, Golden Vow, Lightning Shrouded Cragtier, Shard of Alexander, Godfrey Icon, or Lightning Scorpion can greatly increase its damage and turn you into an absolute range god. Now I know what you're thinking, why not just use a Faith build? Well, the Bolt of Grand Sachs Ash of War scales off of Dex and weapon level, but the attack still does lightning damage. This means that you can deal increased damage to heavily armored enemies and dragons. Considering you can get this weapon right after beating Godfrey fairly early in the game, it can be really easy to build around, and you can throw lightning bolts to your heart's desires. Next up at number 7, I have the Bloodhound's Fang. This is another weapon that can be found very early in the game and can easily scale throughout the entire game with both Dex and Strength. The main appeal is the Ash of War, Bloodhound's Finesse. It is a 2-part attack that upon using flips you backwards with a sweeping motion dealing decent damage, and in the second part you're teleporting forward to deal huge damage. This weapon art only takes 2 seconds to use, so it's one of the fastest weapon arts in the game, making it pretty spammable if you stagger a boss. Not only is it just good for the damage and cast time, since the first cast flips backwards, it is amazing for dodging or completely getting yourself out of a bad situation, and it only costs 8 FP to use on the first cast, which is basically nothing. This can easily create damage windows, letting you get an extra few hits in where you normally wouldn't be able to. Overall, if you are just looking for a solid weapon with an easy playstyle that is not hard to build around, just get the Bloodhound's Fang. Alright, moving on to number 6, I have the Rivers of Blood. When Elden Ring first came out, Rivers of Blood was the most broken weapon in the game, no doubt. Players were easily beating the game with little to no challenge. However, this weapon has been nerfed multiple times over the years, and most of the player base has dropped it. Even though it was nerfed, Rivers of Blood is still an amazing weapon with high bleed buildup potential and excellent range due to its Ash of War Corpse Piler, which makes it an amazing choice for any bleed focused builds. Not to mention, as a katana, it still has fast attacks and great reach, while still dealing considerable damage. Just because a weapon isn't the best anymore doesn't make it a bad weapon. With the right talismans and gear, this can easily still be a top tier weapon. Kicking off my top 5, I have the Backhand Blade. This is one of the first weapons you will most likely come across in Shadow of the Earth Tree. The Backhand Blade is swiftly becoming a lot of players' new favorite weapon. Scaling S with dexterity, it is no joke when it comes to damage, and does its its job even better when you put bleed on it. With its weapon art blind spot, you can maneuver around the arena easily, and even though it doesn't have as many iframes as dodge rolling, it can easily create opportunities you wouldn't normally have to deal damage and build bleed. And when you dual wield the Backhand Blade, it only grows stronger with its fast attacks and strong combo potential. Next up at number 4, I have Moins Sacred Spear. Bleed is probably the most broken effect in all of the Souls games, and in Elden Ring, it shines brightly. No other weapon can abuse the power of bleed like Moins Sacred Spear can. With the Bloodborne Ritual Ash of War, you can apply seemingly endless stacks of bleeding to any enemy near you, even if they are behind walls or obstacles. Afterwards, your weapon is enhanced with Blood Flame, which can stack more bleeding, and Moins Blade isn't just good because of its Ash of War. It scales heavily off of Arcane and Strength, meaning it can do more damage on its own. It also has the longest reach of any spear in the game, and has a great moveset with a 3-hit combo after running that can mow down plenty of foes. If you pair this with the Fingerprint Shield, you are set for one really fun run and an easy playthrough where bosses are nothing to worry about. Moving on to number 3, I have Blood Fiends Arm. When Shadow of the Erd Tree dropped, quite a few weapons were a little overtuned to say the least, but none were more than Blood Fiends Arm. Since its release, this weapon was nerfed, but it's still insanely powerful, allowing for 208 blood loss buildup and a huge 2-handed strong attack that hits multiple times, pretty much guaranteeing blood loss every 1 or 2 heavy attacks. Not to mention the crazy amount of stagger this weapon has on its heavy attacks, as well as being able to stagger most bosses in just a few hits, allowing for even easier bleed procs. Most boss fights with this thing are just go in, land 1 or 2 heavy attacks, stagger the boss, land 2 more heavy attacks, and the boss is already practically dead from blood loss alone. The only downside is that it's not the prettiest looking weapon, but don't judge a book by its cover, I guess. Next up at number 2, I have Uporia. Elden Ring has no shortage when it comes to unique weapons with unique mechanics, but Uporia probably has the coolest unique mechanic in the entire game. Landing attacks builds up luster, and upon every attack the twin blade will glow brighter and brighter until you can use the Ash of War to spin the twin blade rapidly and unleash a massive beam of light which deals a massive amount of damage, able to one-shot most enemies in the game. Full charge requires 15 hits and the stacks fall off fast, but since Uporia is a twin blade, landing fast consecutive hits is no issue. The only issue is most normal enemies will die before you get to use your Ash of War due to the amount of damage this thing deals. It scales off of strength, dex, and faith, allowing for insane damage potential and can be quite flexible in builds. All around an amazing choice if you are looking for a unique weapon with crazy range, damage potential, and the ability to shred bosses. Finally, in the glorious number 1 spot, I have the Blasphemous Blade. This is by far the most solid weapon in the entire game, and believe it or not, it's surprisingly not a bleed weapon. This scales off of strength, dex, and faith like Uporia, but does not require nearly as much setup for its Ash of War, Taker's Flame, which engulfs the blade with flames, sending them forward and dealing damage, stealing HP from all that it touches. The thing is, the flame from the blade scales off of faith, meaning if you have enough faith, you can deal massive damage and it can keep you alive as long as you can hit the projectile. With the right talisman setup, this thing is completely unstoppable, making any playthrough completely trivial. That was my top 10 weapons in Elden Ring. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you'll like this video where I rank every Soulsborne game from worst to best. Have a good day, bye bye.